Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Commons in Conversation. My name is Drew Lindsay. I'm a writer and editor at the Chronicle and Philanthropy. If you see my tea chattering, just know that my house has lost heat and I'm freezing to death. So if you want to send some warm feelings to me, I'd appreciate it. Just so you know, this is the fourth in a series of one-on-one interviews we're having with leaders in nonprofit world and philanthropy who are working to strengthen democracy and bring Americans together at a time really of polarization, deep division. You can see all of our interviews at the Chronicle Philanthropy's YouTube channel. The series is an extension of the Commons, which is our dedicated line of coverage we launched in April to explore the country's divides. And when I say that, people automatically jump to a political divides. We're in election season, but our coverage really is extending to look beyond politics. We're looking at division along lines of race, gender, the rural-urban divide, race, all sorts of things. So you can check out all that we've done and all that we're going to be doing at philanthropy.com/the commons. I'm really excited today to have Nealin Parker as our guest. Nealin and I have had lots of conversations over the past month. She is a wonderful storyteller with a lot of great background and history. She is head of Common Ground USA, which is the U.S. affiliate for Search for Common Ground. That's the oldest and largest peace-building organization in the world. It started during the Cold War and has worked in some of the globe's biggest hotspots. We're talking about the Middle East, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, and a whole host of others. In the United States, the organization is working in a lot of election battleground states and was actually on the ground in Pennsylvania when former President Donald Trump was shot during his rally in July. So their work has been critical now and is even more critical as we come up to the elections. Nealin, thanks so much for taking time to join us.
Drew, thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really glad to be here.
I do want to tell our audience our short form format for these conversations. I mean, we don't have a Q&A, but Nealin has graciously agreed to stay behind a little bit afterwards on LinkedIn and answer any questions you have. So this won't be part of our broadcast, but you can put any questions you have for Nealin in the comments. She'll hang around for a few minutes and try to answer anything that comes up. So before we get started, before we get started talking about the work of Common Ground, I want to talk a little bit about yourself and your career. You're working in the United States now, but for most of your career, you've worked outside the United States in a lot of countries that have seen war, internal strife, places like Liberia, Kenya, and Afghanistan. We're going to show a few of the pictures that you've shared with us from Liberia, and I was hoping you could give us a little context on the work there and this moment in time that you were capturing in Liberia.
Yeah, thank you. I spent about 15 years working overseas in countries in conflict, and I specifically worked on elections. The photograph that you have up right now is actually a bit special to me. I was deep in the throes of typhoid and malaria and was in quarantine at that time. But this election was the first post-conflict election that Liberia had had in 2005. It was also an election in which the first female head of state was elected in the continent of Africa. And so it was a really momentous time for the whole of the country and for me personally. I just looking at the photograph reminds me of a woman who worked for me and had been taken as a slave for many years, made her way amazingly back to Liberia. But by the time she'd gotten there, had lost her native language and couldn't speak to her mother anymore. But she could on that day vote. And it was such a poignant reminder of all of the injustice that happens in the world, but exactly how profound it is that each voter is afforded the dignity of an equal vote. And so you can see in that photo, this is a line of people who are wanting to vote on October 11th in 2025, hoping to make their individual voices known. And I think that probably is quite motivating for why I've continued this work, but also why I feel the pull to do this work in the United States and why elections, I think, are so important here.
And if I could ask, I think one of the most important things to that woman you're talking about is that she had the vote, she had the power to make change, but the people who'd taken her slave didn't have that vote. Is that right?
That's exactly right. So she was in fact on equal footing with every warlord, with anyone who ravaged through her towns, and she was in a position that those who took her away to another country were not in, where she had the vote to determine the future of her country, and they did not as non-Liberians.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to the United States. We have an election coming up, and a very important election. There's a feeling perhaps that there's, the power of our elections is a bit challenged and questioned. I want to take you back to the notion of why you started Search for Common Ground. You were doing all this work abroad, and you saw some red flags in the United States, in this country, and you really pressed Search for Common Ground to open a U.S. office. Tell us about those red flags, what you were seeing that reminded you of the work you were doing abroad and the trouble that lay ahead.
So I think there are a couple of things. One is just the psychological steps that we have to take to be able to do harm to one another. We have to see each other as somehow different from humanity. In other words, we have to see that we are in a position either where we think somebody else is less human or less deserving of dignity, or we think they think that about us. And that's a very important psychological step to take, because then you can do harm to someone else that you feel like is you protecting yourself, even as it is an aggressive action. And what I started to see in the United States, this was over a decade ago, but I started to see the separation, then the kind of dehumanization, the sense that not only is somebody different from me, not only will they vote differently from me, or do they live differently from me, do they have different faith than I have, but they are actually my enemy. They are even potentially someone who will do harm to me, and someone who is potentially evil. Those kinds of psychological steps are really important and very counterproductive set of things necessary for people to do harm. And I've since then seen things like normalization of violence in our politics, the idea that it would be part of our political system for you to receive threats as a candidate, or for your family to even. The kind of more affective and extreme polarization that breaks down the way that our Congress works, our decision makings works, our policies work, and the distrust in our systems. All of those things come together in ways that affect each other. So it's not just that there's one thing that's happening right now. It's that on the social side, on the structural side, in our leadership, we have increased polarization in ways that are almost a vicious cycle.
And I think what was surprising to me when we first talked is a lot of these things you're talking about are what we're covering in the Commons, the polarization in the country. How do you bring people together? How do you help them see each other as people? But you talked about very specific early response systems and early warning systems that sort of alert you to what violence might be coming, how this all might lead to violence. So I was hoping you could explain that here. I know you did some of this in Liberia, so there are parallels, but what does an early warning system look like?
Yeah, I love that you started with Liberia, because that's actually a place that part of what I was doing there was setting up early warning, early response systems. And what that means is that you get a network of people in communities together from across a lot of differences that have reach, that can find out information and that can share information back out. And you put them together in a room. And then when you hear information, you can share that out with the group, find out if it's accurate, or they can pull up information, find out what's going on in their community, figure out and tell you, actually, this is kind of a big deal. So, it is a big deal that people are no longer going to the night market on Friday evening is an indicator that might be locally really important, but that you might not pick up on the national level as important for where there might be a spike in violence, for example. Same things in the United States. So we took this principle that you see as a way to reduce the likelihood of violence in countries around the world. Search also put an early warning, early response network together in Nigeria that was influential in the way that we thought about the networks that we put together in the United States. And then we apply it back to the US. The United States is a very rich country in civil society. We have more than any place I've ever worked, there are people who are leaders on the ground in functional communities who have a huge sense of a pride of place, who are very enthusiastic about coming together across differences in service of doing honor to the place that they are from.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when I say civil society, I mean, everything from faith leaders, head of Chamber of Commerce, sports teams and leaders. There are lots of different kinds of influence that we have, social capital that people carry. Sometimes we refer to it as people's Jedi skills. And if you bring them together across these differences ahead of time, then they're in a much stronger position to, first of all, gather information that they wouldn't otherwise be privy to. But in addition to that, to make plans and solutions across those differences that bind us together more strongly rather than putting up walls. Like when a crisis happens, anyone's instinct is to go to somewhere safe. That is what our psychology needs. And we do it. And we do a great job with that. But the problem with that is if you pull apart when a crisis happens and it keeps happening, then you pull farther and farther and farther apart, and then you start to erect walls. And at the end of the crisis, you have to actually start to break down the walls to get back to your steady state. If you've come together across the differences and built a safe place across those differences ahead of time, then when people need to retreat to a place of safety, it doesn't mean pulling apart. It means that we can come together and we can solve the problem that is a mutual problem together.
Let me, to give it some concreteness, you and I talked directly after the assassination attempt of former President Trump in July. You had your network built. Talk a little bit about that network, who the people were, and how it operationalized and mobilized directly after that shooting. Because there was a lot of discussion about, could this spiral out? Did that one event trigger a lot of other violence? And it didn't happen. You and I have talked. This was a story because it didn't happen. There was no violence. But what specifically did your network do?
Yeah. So just to give a little bit of a context, we have a network that's in Pennsylvania and in Texas with our partners Over Zero. They have a similar network in Springfield, Ohio. In Ohio, where they were doing a lot of work in Springfield, as you can imagine, and in Arizona. So we had a team that was on the ground in Pennsylvania, and as I described, it's a group with a lot of different backgrounds, ideologically and in terms of what their day jobs are, that have been seeing what's happening in Pennsylvania and want to do something about it. So in this case, let me give just one example, because there's a lot of work that we were doing there. There's a lot of work that other communities are doing as well. But there was a member of the network who was a faith leader and organized faith leaders across different faiths, different geographies, different ideologies, different backgrounds to come together to the Fairground. Now, the Fairground in Butler is a place that is a community space. It's where the people in that community come together often to celebrate being together. It became a symbol in that moment of what our country looks like when we tear apart and what violence does. So they came together across these differences to reconsecrate that space and to reconsecrate that land. Now, part of that was healing. How does the community deal with the fact that not only was there an attempted assassination, but there was a real loss of life in that community? A family man who was in the fire department and really part of that community. So you need some of that healing. But from a political violence prevention perspective, there's also that opportunity in that moment for those hurts to turn into either copycat violence or reprisal violence. And to be able to stop that cycle, community leaders rededicate that space and that community to being a symbol of what it means to come together to heal and what it means to come together to reestablish this is who we are as a community. That's one way of having a response that also has a de-escalatory component to it.
What does reconsecrating that space look like? What is that dedication of that space? What actually happened?
It means in that moment bringing in the sacred reminder of
Hmm.
this is a space where beauty flourishes, where we come together, where depending on your faith, where God's people live, and try to reflect the best of who we are and who we might be.
Hmm.
That same group of faith leaders has also come together and then expanded to try to advocate for political leaders to reduce the amount of violent rhetoric in their language. So has had work as advocates as well as faith leaders, and seeing themselves as greater than the sum of their parts by coming together, and also very actionable.
Hmm. Now, let me ask, and I'm cognizant we've hit sort of 15 minutes, and my bosses will be upset if I go much longer, but I do want to, we're talking about election-related violence. You and Search for Common Ground have been working for months, if not years, to prepare for this moment, November 5th, 2024. What were your expectations going into this? Where do you feel like we stand as a country, and what do you expect heading up to the election?
It is my expectation that we will see violence around this election. But that is what we are built for. And we are but one small piece of a very busy and very impressive ecosystem that is working very hard to remind us of the preciousness of this democracy, to support the elections volunteers and election workers, to make voting free, fair, open, transparent, and following the rule of law. So I think where my head is right now is this is what we're built for, and it's time to put one foot in front of the other and sort of stay that course. I think what I think for this country is that we shouldn't fall into the trap of imagining that because bad things are happening, they are inevitable in our future. I work in countries recovering from war. They tell
Yeah.
the impossible story of the end of the bad and the turning around to the good.
Yeah.
And there is nothing in this country that says that that cannot be our tomorrow. And the people who need to make that decision are, in fact, us.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the distinctions you've made in our conversations is that you've worked, as you said, in places recovering from war. We aren't recovering from war. The United States has a lot of advantages in a sense of dealing with this. And that's something we have to hold on to as we go forward.
I think that's
Yeah.
exactly right.
Terrific. Well, listen, we have hit the time mark. I really, really appreciate your time and coming on. I've had so many good conversations, and I'm glad just to share a snippet with our audience of conversations. I encourage you all, if you have questions for Nealin, to drop them into a comment on LinkedIn. Again, she'll respond on those. As a reminder, in 2 weeks, we're going to have another great conversation. We'll be talking with Amy McIsaac of Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement. Amy's done over several years this incredible work looking at the language that we use around democracy and civic engagement and how those words like democracy and civic engagement, the public receives them, what baggage comes with them. And she has some advice for nonprofit leaders on how to use those words in proper context so messages are conveyed accurately. So please, again, that will be October 30th, 12:30 again. We try to do these every 2 weeks. So really appreciate your time and participation here, and have a good rest of the day.